Welcome back to the Seattle Bird Podcast. I had the opportunity to interview Jente Ottenburghs. He is an evolutionary ecologist, a lecturer at Wageningen University, and a birdwatcher. Please enjoy this episode. Explain to the listeners, and partially to me, what happened in the most recent ice age with bird species and how that ties into hybrids.
So what happened during the ice ages is especially in Europe and North America, you get the ice sheets that are coming down from the north because the earth is cooling down, and this is pushing species down to the south, and they get pushed into different parts of Europe or North America, and you get these kind of subpopulations that are separated from each other, and they just continue evolving while they're there. And then after the ice ages, the ice sheets retract, and these birds, they start colonizing the north again, and they come into contact with each other. And because they've been evolving separately for some time, they have evolved some differences. In some cases, they turned into different species, but they can often still hybridize. And you get these hybrid zones where individuals from two separate populations start meeting again. And the famous example in Europe is the two crow species. So I think it's carrion crow and hooded crow. And there's a whole hybrid zone running through Europe where these two species are now interbreeding with each other.
Where's the hybrid zone?
It starts in Ireland, and then it runs through Denmark, Germany, all the way down to Italy. So it's quite a big range. What's really cool is if you're traveling in Europe, you will see them. So if you're, for example, in the Netherlands, you will see the black crows, so the carrion crows. But if you then go to Denmark, Sweden, so Scandinavia, suddenly it's all hooded crow. And somewhere in the middle is this hybrid zone.
On one side, you've got the carrion crow, and you've got the hooded crow, and you've got a zone in the middle. But with back crossing, couldn't there be more zones, like the 3/4 on either side?
Yeah, you kind of have, in the middle you have really the hybrid zone, but you indeed get some back crosses, so it's kind of a continuum that slowly moves out from the zone. And what you often have is a so-called tension zone, so that's a hybrid zone where you get hybrids, but for some reason there is selection against the hybrids. Maybe because they're not very fertile or they suffer from other problems. So what happens is you get hybrids within the zone, but they don't really spread out of the zone because they just cannot adapt to the environment outside of the zone. And then in technical terms, that's called a tension zone. But what you often see is what you just described, more of a gradual change throughout the hybrid zone.
Can scientists predict using DNA evidence or other techniques whether two birds can hybridize? Or do they have to find an example of a hybrid in the wild?
So I would say to really prove it, you really have to indeed find the hybrid. Luckily, there's genetic techniques to identify the hybrids. Really making predictions is a bit more tricky because whether two species hybridize depends on a lot of factors. And one thing is that over time, species develop genetic differences. And often these differences, they're still compatible, so you can get hybrids. But once you get an incompatible difference, they cannot hybridize anymore. And because mutations are random, so they just happen without any direction, it could happen that two species that are very closely related just happen to have this one mutation that makes them incompatible and they cannot hybridize. But there's also examples of species that diverged more than 50 million years ago, but they can still hybridize. So they still have these different genetic differences that are still compatible for some reason.
What DNA or traits would have to be affected to prevent species from hybridizing?
So you have different options. One could be that they don't see each other as potential mates. So then we're talking about what they call pre-mating isolation. So it's two species they meet, but they don't see each other as potential mates because they evolved preferences for certain traits that the other species doesn't have. But the mutations I was more referring to are the ones that lead to hybrids that are infertile, so they might interbreed with each other, but the eggs that they produce are sterile, so there's no embryos inside. So that's really mutations that intervene with development, or for the hybrid. If let's say you get hybrids and they're sterile, then it has to do with mutations that make the sperm inefficient, or makes sperm cells that don't work properly. I think the best example is if two species hybridize and there's mutations that lead to embryos that don't develop well, then you have clear separate species.
What about how does climate change affect the process of hybridization?
That's a really good question, because the idea is that maybe climate change could make hybridization more common. Because in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about the ice ages and how this led to species being isolated and coming back together. And now with climate change, we also see that species are shifting their range. So they're often going more to the north, following the habitat that's suitable for them. And because of this, they come into contact with other species. And a famous example outside of birds is polar bears and grizzly bears. So the polar bears are coming to the south because there's no ice anymore in the north. And then the grizzly bears are moving more to the north. And they're now actually hybridizing with each other. And you get these grizzly bears. And this also happened during the ice ages. There were then similar dynamics going on. And I'm expecting that the same will probably happen with some bird species, where some species are moving to the north into the range of other ones and starting to hybridize.
When birds were being introduced between continents because of like human activities like shipping and stuff, did that cause, besides like massive ecological damage, did that also cause new hybridization?
So when it comes to birds, there's, for example, in Europe you have the introduction of certain quail species for hunting purposes, and these then start interbreeding with the local quail species, and that has led to the decline of the local quail species. For example, in the Alp region in Italy, for example. There's the case, of course, of introduction of mallards all around the world. And mallards just interbreed with what's ever available. So you get all kinds of hybrids. So I mentioned the black duck in North America, but you also have the New Zealand duck. In Australia, they hybridize with the duck species. In Europe, they hybridize with several duck species. So the introduction of mallards all across the world for hunting and breeding purposes has led to a lot of hybridization going on. And whether that's beneficial or detrimental, that needs to be figured out for all these different species.
Interesting, because at least here in North America, we have all these like European species, like European starling, that are invasive.
Yeah, I think with the starling, probably because it evolved in Europe for such a long time, it doesn't really have a species here that it can easily hybridize with. So I think from a hybridization perspective, it's safe to introduce it. From an ecological perspective, maybe not such a good idea. So that's, I think, a nice example where you don't get hybridization.
So how come mallards can still hybridize with species all around the world?
That actually has to do with the fact that the mallard, like the group of mallard species, let's call them, they're quite recent. So there's a kind of explosive radiation of duck species, including the mallard. So they're all quite closely related to each other. So when you then introduce the mallard back into an area, because probably it lived there before, they're so closely related to the local species that they can still hybridize with it. So it's a nice example of a very recent radiation of duck species.
Yeah, interesting. I have another question. I don't know if you know much about this, but like, which birds have the best language capabilities? And are we, like, I just heard in the news, like, we have some AI tool that helped us decode whale language. What are we closest to understanding bird language?
So I think if you look at the research into birdsong, Of course, the zebra finch is used quite a lot in the laboratory. But when it comes to language, I think probably parrots are a good species to study. And I wouldn't be surprised that at some point we'll also have an AI system to talk to birds. Whether we will understand them or not, we'll see. But I think because parrots can really mimic our sounds, a lot of research is going into that. But then it's really more about the cognition of whether they can understand what they're saying. And when you're thinking more about the evolution of singing, then I think the zebra finch has been used more often. Yeah, as you say, it's not really my field, so it's difficult to say something about it.
I also asked him all about my favorite bird, the Canada goose.
So in Seattle, I think you mentioned that there's Canada geese, and I did my PhD on geese. They're kind of my favorite group of birds.
They're also my favorite bird.
Ah, that's good to hear. And there's actually hybridization between Canada geese and Canada goose and cackling goose. In Canada, there's a hybrid zone. But when you look a bit more broadly, there's a lot of hybrids, especially in Europe, between Canada goose and grey-leg goose. Because the Canada geese, they're introduced in Europe, and they just started hybridizing with everything that they meet. So most of the hybrids we get in Europe are actually Canada goose and grey-leg goose. But I'm not sure if it's also the case in Seattle, in the US.
Oh, I don't know enough about Canada geese and cackling geese to tell whether it's a Canada goose cackling goose hybrid, but I mean there are different sizes of these birds, and I heard there's like 11 subspecies if you combine those two species. How did those subspecies develop, and why are the Canada goose maxima so much larger than the cackling goose minima?
That's a good. It's actually a question. When I defended my PhD, I got a similar question. So where do all these subspecies come from? I think the honest answer is we don't really know yet. We're still looking into it. But one thing has to do with the fact that if you live in a cold environment, you want to save heat, and one way of doing that is becoming bigger. So that's why you see that as you go more to the north, birds tend to become bigger, and they also tend to have shorter wings to kind of preserve more of the heat. So one idea is that these size differences you see in Canada geese have to do with the fact that the more northern species are a bit bigger, so they can tolerate the cold much better than other species. And what's also really interesting is that they used to be classified as one species, so Canada goose and cackling goose. But it turns out that they're not each other's closest relatives. So the closest relative of the cackling goose is actually the barnacle goose. So what probably happened is that you get a split between Canada goose and cackling goose, and then one population of cackling geese became isolated in Europe and then evolved into the barnacle goose. So if you look at the evolutionary tree, they're actually separate species.
Why are some Canada geese dusky?
That I actually don't know, to be honest. Because I guess the dusky has to do with the plumage coloration, but I haven't come across any papers really explaining why they have this plumage pattern.
Why are Canada geese so misunderstood by like people?
I think because they come across very aggressive. What they're doing is they're just protecting their territory, or when they have goslings, they're protecting their goslings, of course. And because they're quite big birds, they come across very aggressive. But I think a lot of birds, they will protect their territory. I went to the US a couple of years ago in San Diego, and I was kind of attacked by a hummingbird. I think it was Anna's hummingbird. And by attacked, I just mean it flew over my head a couple of times, probably because I got too close to the nest or maybe a partner. It's very cute because it's a small thing that's attacking you. But when the Canada goose attacks, it's not cute anymore, and you better run. So I think that kind of leads to this misunderstanding that we often see them as very aggressive birds. But when you, let's say, meet them outside of the breeding season, they're often very tame birds. You can kind of walk along them.
I have another question about Canada geese. Why I've seen them often just being aggressive to each other, not even in like breeding season, and like honking up a storm, hissing and all that, but for no apparent reason. Do you know why that is?
I think they kind of outside of the breeding season, they actually partner up during the non-breeding season, and they're just preventing other geese from getting too close to their partner. So I think they're kind of on edge during the whole year. So during the non-breeding season, they're protecting their partner. During the breeding season, protecting their nest and their goslings. So I think in the end, you have a big bird species that's aggressive almost the whole year, and that's why they're often misunderstood by humans, I guess.
He also runs a fantastic blog called Avian Hybrids.
So yeah, the blog Avian Hybrids, it started in I think 2014, 2015. And it was actually at the start of my PhD. I was looking into hybridization in birds. And I was reading papers, so scientific papers, and I was just making short summaries for myself. And then I realized maybe other people can also benefit from these summaries, and that's how the website got started. And then over time, I just started writing more and more, and now I'm writing weekly blogs about not only hybridization in birds, but just bird science in general.
And I even saw an article that's about cow hybrids.
Yes. So especially in the beginning, when I came across papers on hybridization, and I thought it was a cool topic, I would just write about it. So I've covered, like you say, the cows. I think also sharks, whales, a bit of everything, even fungus.
What are some of your favorite stories you've shared on the blogs?
One of the concepts that I find most interesting is called adaptive introgression. And introgression refers to the exchange of DNA between species through hybridization. So that means two species hybridize, you get a hybrid, it back crosses with one of the species, and you get DNA moving from one species to the other. And one example is, for example, that humans have Neanderthal DNA. That's an example of introgression in our species. Mm-hmm. And it's called adaptive introgression when this exchange of DNA leads to an adaptive advantage for one of the species. And it turns out that there are these salt marsh sparrows on the eastern side of the US, and they have adapted to living in these salty conditions. And it turns out that some of these genes have been exchanged between the species that are living there. So you have, for example, Nelson sparrow, salt marsh sparrow that are hybridizing. And they have exchanged genes, and these genes have allowed some of the sparrows to adapt to the salt marshes. So I think that's a really cool example of how hybridization can also be beneficial for a species.
Oh yeah, has hybridization ever created a new species?
So that's actually my second favorite example from the blog. So this concept that you described, the origin of new species through hybridization, is called hybrid speciation. And I wrote a paper a couple of years ago, like showing what's the evidence for hybrid species in birds. And I could only find about, I think, 6 or 7 cases. And the most famous one is the Italian sparrow. So that's a hybrid between the house sparrow and the Spanish sparrow. So they hybridized with each other about 10,000 years ago. And then a population of these hybrids became isolated in Italy and then evolved into the Italian sparrow. So that's a very clear case of a hybrid species through in birds. And another cool one is a mannequin species in South America, where again you have two species that are hybridizing, and the hybrid actually has a different head color, which makes it less attractive for both species.
So then they couldn't go back to the other species, and they were by themselves.
Yeah, so the hybrids kind of interbreed amongst each other, and you get a hybrid population.
What about like chickadees?
Yeah, I think that there's one cool study. I forgot which two species hybridized, but it was two chickadee species. And the idea was that it could be that when you combine two species that are quite different genetically, something might go wrong in the development of the brain, and perhaps hybrids are, to put it bluntly, stupid compared to the pure species. And they did some experiments in chickadees where they had to solve a puzzle, and it turned out that indeed hybrids are not so good at solving puzzles compared to the two pure species. Yeah, so it could be that this is a kind of selection pressure against hybrids in the wild, because of course in the wild they also have to kind of solve puzzles to find food. So it's possible that hybrids are surviving less well because, well, they're more stupid than the other two species that hybridized.
Do you have anything about juncos?
So there was this one paper where they found a population of these dark-eyed juncos in, I think it was California, on the campus of the, let's see, University of California in San Diego. And the question was, where do they come from? So they did some genetic analysis, and they found that you can call them kind of urban birds because they're living in the city, and they were still hybridizing with birds in the more natural areas, exchanging genes, and this might have helped them adapt to the urban environment. So again, kind of an example of adaptive integration where genes that are beneficial in a certain environment come from one population into the other. And if I have a quick look, they found one gene that was related to heavy metal tolerance. So of course, when you live in a city, there's more heavy metals in the environment. So they might have adapted to that. And the other one was related to a gene related to high frequency hearing. And the idea is that if you live in a city, there's a lot of low frequency sounds like cars passing by. And what you often see is that birds in cities, they sing at a higher frequency. So they don't have this interference from the low frequency car noise. So it could also be that they kind of adapted to singing at a higher frequency so they can communicate with each other better in the cities.
Any other stories you have to share?
Maybe a nice one that I just recently wrote about was about kingfishers. Because kingfishers have this behavior where they dive into the water, and you often get very beautiful pictures when you see a kingfisher just before it hits the surface of the water. And recently there was a genetic study where they looked at kind of the genetics of being what they call a plunge diver, and they found some genes related to this behavior. And one cool one was a gene related to the brain development that they also find in woodpeckers.
Oh wow, I guess like plunging your head into a tree.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of they don't know the exact mechanism of how it works morphologically, but probably there's some mechanism in the brain that protects both woodpeckers and kingfishers from concussions when they either hit the water or hit the tree. So I think that was a cool finding, that very different species converge upon the same solution when you wait for long enough.
If you were a bird, what bird would you be?
That's always a difficult one. I really enjoy watching swifts fly around. They're now quite active. And just the way that they zoom through the air, they look more free than other birds, make a lot of sound. So I think a swift would be a cool bird.
What you were saying about adaptive integration makes me think about how, like this alternate viewpoint where instead of birds having genes, about how genes might have birds.
I think it's a nice way of looking at it. It relates to like Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene. They're just using the bird as a vehicle to get around. Because often when I'm doing my research, I take the gene perspective, where you think like how can a gene easily spread from one population to the other, and then this adaptive integration can be a good way for a gene to spread around the world. So if I was a gene, I would be in a mallard probably.
All right, cool. Thank you so much.